All right, we're going to look at our last topic of Unit 5, which is going to talk about the intellectual and artistic movement known as Romanticism. Now, the good news is that Romanticism is going to be covered later on. It shows up in the course description in Unit 7, I believe. So we're going to look at it much more in depth there. We don't really need to talk too much about Romanticism here. When we get to Unit 7 for the review videos, I am going to show you examples of romantic works of art. We'll look at J.M.W. Turner, Eugene Delacroix. We will look at David Caspar Frederick, a whole bunch of others. So we will have a little art slide for Romanticism at that particular time, but we don't really need to do that for this particular section of the course description. Unit 5.8 is basically just establishing what the features of Romanticism are, and that its beginnings take shape as a reaction against the promotion of rationality from the Enlightenment, and then the excessive imposition of rationality, as they see it, from the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. So it's a reactionary movement against the rationality of those earlier eras. Okay, so Romanticism, the first thing I wrote in my notes, reaction against rationality, right? It is going to focus much more on intuition and emotion and feeling and tradition and these sorts of things as the guidance for human behavior and society, as opposed to scientific and rational analysis of things. So the big picture thing you want to know about Romanticism, if it's going to be asked about in the 1648 to 1815 time period, which I don't think it will. I think it will come into the 19th century. But if it is basically how and why Romanticism and a religious revival that takes place will challenge Enlightenment ideas. Okay, so when I hear Romanticism, the three things that I focus on, right? This romantic art or literature is going to focus on one of three things. Number one, the awesomeness of nature, right? The scientific approach, the Newtonian mechanism approach to nature was that it was rational and that you could study it and learn it and therefore harness its power. Well, the Romantics are going to present nature as much more destructive and wild and powerful, and that humans are at the mercy of nature, not the other way around, that the more rational approach to the world had created. The second thing I think of when I think of Romanticism is that rural, medieval, and Christianity were totally awesome, and that they were things that made life stable and gave meaning to life, and that we should go back to those sorts of things. So anything having to do with emotion. I don't know if you remember, but in the PSP we had for this packet, we read about someone talking about the old churches of France made you closer to God, that Christianity was the key to meaning. And of course, if you remember the Enlightenment and the French Revolution in particular, it was pretty harsh on the Roman Catholic Church. And then the third thing I think of is nationalist passion, right? They are going to argue for a national history, that people had a shared history and it gave them power and meaning to their lives. And they're going to often celebrate, political revolutions. And of course, we're going to look at examples of all these things, but those are the three things, right? Nature is awesome and uncontrollable, that emotion, intuition, Christianity, feelings matter more than rationality, and that nationalist passions are driving forces in our lives. Okay, so the course description mentions a couple people. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an Enlightenment philosopher, but he was a bit of an outlier when it came to Enlightenment philosophy in a lot of ways. Here, for Romanticism, he is going to argue that emotion is the key to self and societal improvement, not necessarily rational application of things like that. Number two, Romanticism is a reaction to the excessive rationality that we had seen in the French Revolution. Number three, there is a religious revival that takes place. And it goes hand in hand with Romanticism. And the best example of this is the creation of a new version of Christianity known as Methodism, which was created by John Wesley while he was in the American colonies, actually. And it is going to basically focus on feeling God and Jesus in your heart, experiencing God in an emotional, in your feelings, not like the deism that had been the excessive rational God, you know, the clockmaker who's like, okay, I'm done, right? Methodism is about feeling God and that transforming your life. And then finally, there is going to be an argument by the Romantics that revolution and war and rebellion show the emotional power of mass politics and nationalism, which is certainly going to become an issue in the 19th century. And again, it's all about feeling and emotion as opposed to like scientific certainty and rationality. And that's all we need to talk about for Romanticism for now. We will come back and look at examples of that. Now we're going to do a little bit of review of Unit 5, if I can share the screen here. And we're going to look at the course description specifically, and we're going to look at the contextualization, right? And basically, this will help you with your essay. We have to establish context. It's one of the first things we want to do in our essays. Here is the event we're talking about, so we can do one of two things to examine context. If you look up here at the top, it says, to understand context, your students could examine change from and or continuity with preceding historical developments. So what came before, and is this going to continue, or is this something that will change? Or similarities and or differences with contemporaneous historical developments in different regions or geographical areas. All right, so we're going to focus mostly on that first one. Okay, so the first thing that it talks about is the French Revolution. If you see right here, it says different modes of political sovereignty affected the relationship among states and between states and individuals. That's the big idea, but basically the French Revolution posed a fundamental challenge to Europe's existing political and social order. So if you were to write your DBQ about the French Revolution, which I think is a good chance, this is a big topic. I think it's going to be a big topic this year. I don't think they're going to go with some small, I don't think it's going to be cultural life. I don't know for sure. I'm just saying, let's say it's the French Revolution. Okay, so if it's the French Revolution, what you want to talk about is what came before the French Revolution. You could talk about the Enlightenment and how it was affected by the scientific revolution and tried to impose rational ideas onto human institutions. Or you could talk about the old regime, the system of absolute monarchy, of noble privilege, of state-sponsored churches that left out the bourgeoisie as they are emerging because of a growing global network and increasing capitalization of European economies, right? So those are all the things you could talk about for context for the French Revolution. Personally, I would talk about the old regime and the economic changes that lead to the creation of the bourgeoisie, and then how the Enlightenment sort of gave them a voice to push for change and things like that. Okay. Then we see anything mentioned about Napoleon, right? Claiming to defend the ideals of the French Revolution, Napoleon imposed French control over much of Europe. And so you could tie Napoleon, the context of Napoleon is the French Revolution and how he comes to power and the changes that the French Revolution made and how Napoleon is going to move those on to other societies. All right. Another concept we see in the 1648 to 1815 time period that we have reviewed previously was the growing European trade, global network, that sort of thing. Right. And so a lot of the stuff that they talked about in this unit was the political rivalries that emerged because of that. Well, of course, if you're going to establish a context, you would talk about European exploration, voyaging out, getting colonies in the Americas, making trading connections in the Indian Ocean like the Dutch do in the East Indies, like the British do in India, and that there was competition in a mercantilistic world where there's a finite amount of wealth. You want to get as much as possible. That's an idea for context you could talk about there. And then last but not least, this deals with the Enlightenment, right? And the Enlightenment is tied to the scientific revolution, the spread of scientific revolution concepts and practices, and the Enlightenment's application of those concepts and practices led to political, social, and ethical issues that challenge European culture, right? So if the question's about the Enlightenment, I would talk about the scientific revolution as the context. Okay, and then if we go to the last section of Unit 5, we will see a page left intentionally blank. We see the same sort of topics, but we want to know about change and continuity, right? And so this one, instead of talking about the contextualization of the French Revolution, what are the changes and continuities that come about because of the French Revolution and Napoleon, right? And that would be many things that you could talk about. You could talk about how the French Revolution got rid of systems of inequality, of like church autonomy or special privileged churches in their relationships with the states, but maybe a continuity is that Napoleon continues absolute monarchy. You could talk about the French Revolution as just a blip and the restoration of monarchy at the end of it. Or you could talk about how these ideas are going to be unleashed and never really successfully put back into place. All these things, looking at change and continuity, there just seems to be lots of obvious changes. The Enlightenment is going to challenge ideas about politics, economics, and society, but a continuity is that they aren't going to make any steps to include women in those things, with the exception of a few philosophers here and there. And we are going to see the continuation. This is a good continuity. The continuation of Europe's global network, but the change could be a greater degree, more wealth and power, or the change could be who dominates where. Early on, it's Portugal and Spain, but the British and the Dutch are going to emerge in the 18th century as the dominant economic sorts of powers. So those are just some various change continuities you could think of. I don't know if we need to worry about that too much with the 5-document DBQ, but I thought I would go over it. So that's it for this unit. Moving on, we'll get to Unit 6. For those of you who followed this in real time, I'm going to start mass recording these so we can get to the stranger, and you guys can just review these topics whenever you see fit up until May 13th. So for those who watch these all the way to the end, for those who follow them on a day-by-day basis, I'm just going to flood my YouTube feed with as many videos tomorrow as I can. Hopefully I'll get them all recorded for Unit 6 and 7. And then I'll start prepping for reading the stranger, the questions I'm going to have for you, our discussions, our Zoom meetings, all those other things. But until then, I will see you when we get to Unit 6, which is going to bring in our last time period that we need to worry about for this year's AP Euro test. And that is the 1815 to 1914 time period, which we will just call the 19th century. All right, talk to you guys.